Well, you veterans here know the drill for those who are new to this, so we're going to wait just about 20, 30 seconds while everyone joins the webinar. All right. I think we have a quorum, as I like to say. Welcome, everyone, to another virtual briefing of the Claremont Institute. I'm your host of these, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review books and the American Mind. Very happy to have a friend and also a colleague join us today to discuss the latest developments in diversity, equity, and inclusion, discrimination, as we like to say, the topics of critical race theory and others that have cropped up in the news lately. We're gonna have just some introductory remarks from William Jacobson and Scott Yenner. Let me introduce Bill first. William Jacobson is the clinical professor of law and director of the Securities Law Clinic at Cornell Law School. He's the founder of Legal Insurrection Foundation, and before that, the Legal Insurrection blog or website. They run criticalrace.org, which is a clearinghouse for critical race in education, statistics, reports, and all the rest, and equalprotect.org. Our other guest today is Scott Yenner. He's my colleague at the Claremont Institute. He's our senior director of state coalitions based in Tallahassee. As I like to joke, he's Claremont's Florida man. He's coming to us live from Tallahassee. Scott's normal day job is at Boise State University, where he and his family live in Idaho. But these days he's in Florida at least half the month, working on issues like diversity, equity, inclusion, critical race theory, and all the rest in higher education, and on other topics, both with legislators in Florida, but also with others in places like Texas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Alabama, etc. So thank you both for joining me, gentlemen. And I think, the introductory remarks, we've gotten a lot of questions ahead of time. So I think we'll easily fill this hour by taking questions I've received ahead of time and then people asking questions in the Q&A. If you want to ask a question, just click on Q&A and you can feed it into the queue. But so with that, I think we will start with Bill Jacobson.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you for inviting me and having me here. Thank you also to Scott, and thank you to the Claremont Institute, which is so important in protecting our freedoms in this country. They're really a model for little entities like Legal Insurrection Foundation, who aspire to do the great sort of stuff Claremont is doing. So thank you for inviting me to participate in this. So Legal Insurrection Foundation, most people know us through the Legal Insurrection blog, which I started as a solo blog in 2008. And we're now Legal Insurrection Foundation. We still have the blog, but as Ryan mentioned, our fight against DEI, which is ongoing, really, I think, came into focus with criticalrace.org, where in the frenzy of the summer of 2020, we decided we needed to start to catalog how deeply critical race theory and its variants had penetrated into higher education and to a lesser extent for what we do, K through 12, although K through 12 is hugely important. So criticalrace.org is an entity which is a series of interactive databases covering over 500 colleges and universities, all 155 U.S. medical schools, or maybe it's 156, veterinary schools, U.S. military academies, and we have a couple of other databases as well. Elite K through 12 is one of them. And so what we do, we've cataloged it. And I think this topic of the fight against DEI, the continuing fight, people need to understand how deeply penetrated this racialized ideology is throughout academia. Really, it started in the colleges and the universities. It's in the medical schools. The medical schools are the worst of all. It's really disgusting what's going on there with DEI. It's obviously in law schools, and it's all the way down into K through 12 now. So people need to understand this was not something that just happened overnight. A lot of it came to the forefront with the George Floyd death and then the riots and all of that and Black Lives Matter. But this has been two generations, at least two generations in the making. Talk about capture of institutions. So the fight about DEI in many ways is trying to recapture the institutions that have been lost to this pernicious ideology. And so that's what we do at criticalrace.org. But we got so many tips and so many complaints about what was happening. This year we launched Equal Protection Project, which is equalprotect.org. So we're now filing legal claims against mostly education-related entities where we find these discriminatory programs done in the name of DEI. So equalprotect.org is really focused on fighting DEI discrimination through legal means, as well as public relations and publicity. So we understand what's going on very well, and it's something that's going to have to be a generational fight. And it's great to have partners like Claremont and others who are joining in this fight. But nobody should think there's one quick, easy answer. The topic tonight is what comes next. And what comes next is a lot of what we've seen in academia. And this all started in academia. It's now in corporations and elsewhere, but it all started on campuses. It's just with the Supreme Court's affirmative action ruling, it's just going to be pushed underground. They're not going to end the discrimination. What they're going to do is try to hide the evidence of the discrimination. And we're seeing that already. They're eliminating SAT scores. I mean, the primary evidence in the Harvard case for the Asian students showing discrimination was the disparity in SAT scores that you needed to get accepted to Harvard if you were Asian versus if you were Black or Hispanic or even white. And so they're going to eliminate that evidence, but they're not going to eliminate the practices. They're going to now ask students essays to talk about your experience. Tell us how you're going to help them, with diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're not going to ask you your race, but they're going to invite you to volunteer that information. And there's also something else going on that we're beginning to focus on, which is the use of algorithms. Cornell just announced that it was going to start to use algorithms for its admissions. And well, what are they going to search for with the algorithms? They're going to search for keywords and other factors that will allow them to accomplish the quotas that they want without having to admit it. So I think that the battle, a lot of people say, oh, the Supreme Court ended affirmative action. Well, no, it didn't. It ended it maybe legally, but on the ground in the space that Claremont and Legal Insurrection operate, it hasn't ended at all. It's just going deeper underground, and it's taking on new names and new titles. And that's what we're going to see. So I know there are a lot of questions, and I don't want to take up too much time, but that's what we have to focus on. It's going to make our job more difficult at criticalrace.org and equalprotect.org because the low-hanging fruit is not going to be there. Colleges put all the stuff on the websites, and we have researchers who just spend their days going through university websites. But that's not going to be possible anymore. They're going to take all the stuff down from the websites, and then they're going to pretend that it's not happening. So we're going to have to rely on deeper research, and that's what we're looking forward to in the next fight. And there are many other aspects of that fight, that legislative, et cetera, that I'm sure we'll get into. So thank you for having me on. And, I look forward, along with the others, to answering some of the questions that people have.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks for all the great work you all do. Your databases are indispensable. So I encourage everyone to go to criticalrace.org and equalprotect.org. Scott, would you give us the latest from Florida and all your other activities?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that the people on our side who are skeptical of the diversity, equity, inclusion industry and the way it has corrupted the academy and corporations and the NGO archipelago around the country are coming to see that it has a pretty tight relationship with laws that the United States has passed and interpreted over the last 50 plus years. Our colleague at Claremont Institute, Christopher Caldwell, wrote a great book, The Age of Entitlement, that was really on the Civil Rights Act and how it has implications and almost demands, at least after a certain passage of time, the kind of practices that we're now seeing on universities. And that whole thing is being revisited by a lot of scholars now. There's a new book out by a friend of Claremont, Tom Powers, called American Multiculturalism and the Anti-Discrimination Regime. It's just out like last week. that really shows how the approach to civil rights that we've taken in the country has real profound implications for how we educate and how our institutions are designed. Tom calls the civil rights regime architectonic in the book, that it really creates a whole new thing, a whole new like approach to life within our country. And this is like becoming obvious now. It wasn't obvious when these laws were being interpreted by the courts and passed by Congress, but it is being like more obvious now. And now we have like a full-grown monster in our midst. And the affirmative action regime is only really part of it. And if we use Florida as a kind of blueprint for how to fight the DEI regime, we can see some of the things that they've done and some of the problems that they're going to have in fighting it. And it's not dissimilar to what Bill has said about affirmative action, but it's like just different iterations of the same thing. What is happening is Florida has done, I think, 3 important things that no state has tried to do all in tandem. One is it has abolished the use of diversity, equity, inclusion statements in hiring. So often job descriptions or job announcements would require candidates not only to submit their vitas and their research, but also a statement about how they're going to promote diversity, equity, inclusion in the unit. Another thing that Florida did is ban the diversity, equity, inclusion offices. There cannot be offices now in Florida, any of the colleges, any of the universities, dedicated to promoting political activism and dividing people upon the basis of race. And the third thing Florida has done is that they have banned mandatory trainings. So in DEI, so students don't have required trainings when they come in freshman orientation. Search committees do not have mandatory diversity, equity, inclusion training to expose their biases before they go about job searches. And all this law, all these 3 things went into effect in July of this year. And what we've already seen is that they're hiding the football in each of these cases. Instead of having diversity, equity, and DEI statements, they're looking for, do the candidates do the diversity work on their vitas? And they use rubrics to evaluate candidates on the basis of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But they're not using DEI statements. Like technically, they're obeying the letter of the law, but violating the spirit. When it comes to the DEI offices, they're rebranding them. Instead of a vice provost for diversity, equity, and inclusion, they have a vice provost for community engagement and belonging. Sounds kind of like the same words, but they rebrand them all over. This happens at the college level. It happens at the university level. And then, they do training, but it's not mandatory. And it's just that if you want to be on a search committee, you have to take the training, and it's all diversity, equity, inclusion training. But no one is coerced into being on a search committee. So they interpret it like that. And so they're up against a very big problem of whack-a-mole, where they think that they have done something important, but now they have to, at the ground level, try to pound out these offices and defund them and find willing allies in school administrations and at Board of Regents levels that are interested in both identifying these things and in like obeying the law, both in letter and spirit, and getting rid of them. And it's going to be, as Bill said, it's going to be a long slog that requires tons of oversight. And I think, one of the lessons is that, and I know that they're learning this down here in Florida, is that not only banning things, but actually trying to redefine what the universities are about is an important element of actually winning this battle. So what they've done here in Florida, and we've been, kind of involved in this, is redefine the general ed so that they're dictating to the universities what their core classes have to be about, even to the point where they're like making syllabi in the Department of Ed and saying that this is the syllabus that you're going to be using. So one thing that is at least being undertaken now is a revamping of curriculum at universities. They're also becoming interested in, at least their law, I should say, allows them at the next stage to be involved in program evaluation so that they can identify programs that are on the universities that are inconsistent with its purpose and have like political activism sewn into the nature of the disciplines. And then like they won't have a space on the university if they are activist departments. And there are more than a few of those. And they don't all end in the word studies, but some of them do. And so I think that's kind of the next wave that is going on here. The difficulty of playing whack-a-mole with the diversity, equity, inclusion regime, whether it's on the affirmative action front or on the office front or on the training front, is leading people to recognize that there needs to be political control exerted over some of these processes and outcomes, processes dictated to the universities as public universities through state authorities. And I think that's kind of the next stage of what's going to happen here in Florida. And I can like define what that means just a little bit, and then we can take questions. It's one thing to ban affirmative action. It's another thing to define how admissions should be done and like what colorblind admissions need to look like. And, you know, I think that's something that's going to be undertaken here in the next year, where they say, like, we're going to require that you have SAT, ACT, and GPAs in the admission process. And if there are racial disparities that are pretty profound using those criteria, if Blacks have much lower admission standards than whites, then whites have causes for action, or those who are discriminated against have causes for action. So I look forward to the day when those with the authority can impose on the universities an understanding of what admissions will look like. Because I think that's really the next stage in the battle against affirmative action, not trying to identify the ban and enforce the ban, but actually dictate through government institutions what admissions should look like. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time, and we'll be happy to take questions about it.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. We've got 8 or so already digital, but I had some print questions that came in ahead of time, or at least by email. Suzanne asked actually a few questions, and a few of them you answered. And just to paraphrase, she was wondering how you solve this problem of a lot of these colleges, as you say, hiding the ball, appearing to comport with the letter of law and dismantle some DEI stuff, but really shuffling it off into a different aspect. I think you made the case that you just need to be a lot more positive and proactive about defining a lot of these things and narrowing the avenues through which they can avoid the consequences and the new legislation. But she also asks, I know something you're familiar with, Scott, and Bill might have something to add too, but she writes, I live in Oklahoma, a ruby red state, yet our supermajority of lawmakers do not understand the powerful activism behind DEI. How do we convince legislators of the real harm of it and how to act on it?
Well, I mean, I think this is where Bill's work at Legal Insurrection and some of the stuff that we've done in writing reports on what happens in various universities are important. And it's not the only thing that's important. But the first thing that has to be done is they have to be shown that there is a problem. So you can do that by cataloging incidents and policies and curriculum and administrators who are dedicated to these things, and then try to persuade a majority of legislators to act on it. And last year, and Bill might have better numbers than this is according to the Chronicle of Higher Education, there were 40 bills dealing with DEI introduced in 22 different states. So 40 bills, 7 passed. Not a great batting average. And so, I think the first step in convincing red state, including deep red state legislators to act, is to inform. And that, like, if they're not asking the question, then someone outside has to do it.
Yeah, I think what we have to understand is that this is a cultural fight, not just an operational fight. There is not a culture on campuses of valuing the individual. It's all focused on group identity. And so I think there needs to be a cultural fight as well on campuses to get people to understand that DEI is an ideology. It is not the default position. In fact, historically, it's the opposite of what the American ideal is, which is the individual. DEI is a group identity ideology. And but if you see how they act, the administrators on campuses is like, how could you possibly be against DEI? That's not ideological. Only the people who criticize it are ideological. So I think there needs to be a real, educational push. It's not going to come from on campus. It's going to have to come from off campus to educate people that what has taken over the campuses and now the corporations is not our tradition. In fact, it's contrary to our tradition. So there's no one answer to all this. Operationally, yes, you got to eliminate departments. I think DeSantis had it right. You defund. That's part of the answer, but it's not the entirety of the answer because the ideology is so deeply entrenched.
Yeah. Have you guys had any, either of you, any sort of a follow-up question from a different questioner? Douglas asks a very related question to what you ended on, Bill, which is, what are some successful educational or rhetorical efforts and responses to people who think that DEI is just the latest noble extension of the civil rights regime?
Well, again, it's got to come from off campus, and there has to be. I mean, I have seen some groups do it, but you're up against the power of the university, and I think alumni. I know on many campuses there have been alumni free speech groups formed. I know there's one at Cornell, which I think it's had a significant impact. So it's an all hands on deck sort of thing. The parents need to get involved. And long before you ship your kid off to college, and the alumni need to get involved. The one people you cannot count on to diversify the viewpoint on campuses are the faculty or the administrators. They are 100% on board with this, almost every place, at least every place that I've seen. And so I think you just, from all angles, you have to try to educate kids to the fact that group identity is not the answer, but there's no one program that can do that.
Yeah, one of the things that we have done in our reports is try to show people that, like, what they say diversity means and then what diversity really means. And, they say diversity is equal opportunity for all or something like that. And what it really ends up meaning is fewer of the, disfavored groups on campus. The NBA, they say, is the most diverse sports league. And what that ends up meaning is, like, it's mostly minorities and fewer whites. And it gets more diverse every year if there are fewer. Like, it's harsh to say these things, but that's what diversity really means, like, operationally. What does equity mean? Well, they say everyone gets a chance. That's what it means. What it really means is equal outcomes. The percentage of Blacks or women in the population is equal to the percentage of Blacks or women in your college or in your discipline or at the university. So, trying to educate people to be skeptical of the high ideals, so-called, that are represented in the DEI regime, and seeing them for the group identity and the extensions of tyrannical control that they end up requiring, is, like, I think, the politically indispensable thing and the culturally indispensable thing for fighting it.
Yeah, I have one more very practical question from the emails, and then we'll get to the digital questions here. Shane asks, he says he's just started teaching at a community college in Colorado, and he needs to do all this DEI training, and wonders if there's any way to plausibly push back against what is essentially an indoctrination program, or if there are any resources out there that could help him figure out how to navigate that problem or that thicket.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some groups fighting those battles. They're really, in many ways, free speech battles, particularly if you're at a public university. And so, but there's a personal price to be paid. And as somebody who's come under those sort of attacks, I never criticize somebody who makes the choice not to speak out, because you could lose your job. It would be hard to get rehired. So I totally understand that. But if you're not willing to push back, then, maybe find other ways, get involved in groups that you can help out at, support groups that are doing this work, but don't just do nothing. Do what your comfort level is. And, I never forget that, a lot of people don't have the option of speaking out at work. And that's, a real problem. So in terms of refusing to take the DEI test or refusing to attend the struggle sessions, I think that's a personal option. I don't say you shouldn't, but you should at least understand that there can be career consequences to that. And each person needs to decide whether they're willing to take that risk or not.
Yeah, and I just want to operationalize something that Bill said. The line that can't be crossed in these trainings is the doctrine of what they call coerced speech, where you are forced to say you believe something that is not like what you believe. And I had like a training at Boise State where at the end we had to sign a pledge to adhere to the policies that they were putting forward in this training. And I took snapshots of it. I sent it to the person who's in charge of HR. And I said, this is coerced speech. I'll listen to your training, but at the end of the day, I'm not gonna pledge anything about it. And they immediately said, you are now exempt from training for 7 years. All victory. And I think I'll never be taking that training again because they're kind of worried about me being able to record it, which I did, of course, and publicized it, and showed it to the state board and showed it to the legislature. But I totally agree with what Bill said. I'm a tenured professor. I can lose my job too. But the chances are less likely, and everyone should make their own decision, and there's no reason to run alone at a machine gun nest that's pointed at you. So, people should be prudent and recognize the costs that come with doing such things.
Yeah. So one of our former fellows, Adam, asks, and either of you guys can take this. Bill might know some of the jurisprudence a little better, but I'm not sure. Why is it that no court or legislature can seem to put together a ruling or policy that actually stops these university policies? Obviously, the universities are looking for loopholes, but it often seems that the rulings, Supreme Court, or policies, SB 17 in Texas, are deliberately crafted to have loopholes.
Well, the Supreme Court decision in the Students for Fair Admissions case, the Harvard case, you're reading through and it's like, this is great, this is great, this is wonderful. And then there's one sentence thrown in there. It might even be in the last paragraph or the second to last paragraph, which says, but of course, nothing, here prevents, schools from taking into account students' personal experiences with race and with racism by essays or similar things. I'm paraphrasing what they said. And the schools have just driven a truck right through that little loophole, that little opening. And all the schools now are beginning to ask essays. They don't say in the essay, tell us what your race is, but they say in the essay things like, well, if you have had a particular experience with racism, feel free to tell us about it. If you feel you would add to diversity, equity, and inclusion being one of the values of our university, please tell us how you would help add to that value. I'm paraphrasing a question that Cornell is now going to start asking its applicants. It was just announced a few days ago as part of a report that they adopted. And I think I've paraphrased it pretty accurately. So, talk about, yes, things being written, and then there's a loophole. That Supreme Court decision is a massive loophole that the colleges, Harvard, in a very smug way, immediately, like within minutes, tweeted out that that sentence from the Supreme Court decision and said, oh, by all means, we will follow what the Supreme Court wants us to do. Again, I'm paraphrasing. So yeah, it's very, very frustrating that you can't just get a clean piece of legislation or a clean judicial decision. And that's why, great decision by the Supreme Court, but they left that opening. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, and I just want to speak to the law problem that Bill is talking about. So aside from the Supreme Court decision, many of these laws, they ban diversity, equity, inclusion offices. They ban offices that are dedicated to activism, and then administrators come down and they have to go about defining what a diversity office is, what an equity office is, what an inclusion office is, and what an activism promoting office would look like. And, these are more difficult things to do, and this is what makes it easier to hide the football. But I would just say that, it doesn't stop the left from doing it. And they have a vague phrase, and suddenly everyone from J6 is serving 23 years for what? Parading. And it just requires a kind of political will to overcome that vagueness and fire people, defund things, and make examples of institutions that are openly but defying the spirit of the law that has been passed. And I have great, I love the rule of law. I'm big in favor of the rule of law, and that requires identifying the things that the law bans or defunds, and then defunding them. And if there's defiance, then there needs to be consequences, and not being shy about implementing those consequences is, I think, what needs to be done. So it's actually a really difficult job to ban these things. I think there's no perfect way of doing it. There needs to be laws combined with the will to execute them.
Yeah, that's right. We have a question we get great audiences here at Claremont. We have a question from Eric Kaufman, who's written a lot about this. If you all don't know his work, his latest book is a big, very interesting book called White Shift: Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. And it's about not just America, but the West more generally. But Eric asks, can you set up a dedicated office to investigate universities with powers to fine, as well as issue best practice executive guidance on how universities must conduct admissions and what content is out of bounds in fine detail using examples? And then he cites, in Britain, obviously the parliamentary system's a little, makes the top-down action a lot easier in Britain, of course, than in the United States. But he says in Britain, we have an academic freedom directorate with 10 staff, and universities have a duty to promote as well as to protect academic freedom. And then a czar has the power to issue fines and guidance that they must follow, and they have ombudsman powers. Obviously, our federal government can't really do that, but what do you guys have by way of response to that?
Well, I always get very nervous when we give the federal government the power to fine people and to investigate people. So, yeah, it's a frustrating situation we're in, because on the one hand, we want academic freedom, we want free speech, but we're also facing a situation where that's been completely abused throughout academia, and increasingly in cultural institutions, social media, et cetera. So it's a tough situation. So I would prefer that there not be a government, certainly at the federal level, investigative unit to decide what is acceptable conduct. I mean, to some extent, we do have the U.S. Department of Education, so they can investigate, but they should really only be investigating violations of law, not best practices and things like that. So yeah, it's a conundrum. I probably would not want to see that sort of board at the federal level. Certainly, you can't fine people without, some level of due process. I think, again, a lot of this is a cultural issue, and we've got to fight that at every level. But I don't think I'd like a federal board to do that.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Eric. I mean, I'll take the state part of the answer, because the way that American universities are, there's a diverse array of ways that university systems are organized. Here in Florida, for instance, each university has a board of trustees. And the board of trustees can do exactly what you're saying. And they are, in some cases, doing exactly what you're saying. They're acting as that third party. There is a tip line and for violations that end up being reported to the trustees. The thing that makes that work is that they have been very intentional over the last 5 years about their appointments to the board of trustees. So they put people who are allies, who are interested in promoting Governor DeSantis's agenda into these spots, so that they often have pretty responsible people who are on board with the program, the spirit of the program, implementing the oversight of the institutions. And they do also do this at the state level, both through the Department of Education, which oversees the college system, and through the the university system here. So, but they haven't done a formal law here like they did in Britain, I think is what you're describing, Eric. And I do think that would, like they fund the universities, they charter the universities, they dictate to some extent what the public purposes of the universities are. And I think ensuring that they accomplish those public purposes would be the job of such a standing committee.
David asks, when will we see class action suits representing white faculty, staff, students against state universities for the millions of dollars of taxpayer money spent on all the other race and gender combinations through DEI? So that's his question.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the legal claim would be there. The spending of money for something you don't like doesn't necessarily give you a claim to that money. So I think you would have to show some level of discrimination. And that's, what a lot of the claims that we have filed is where you have like a scholarship or a summer internship only open to non-whites. We found one program that was open only to whites, and we filed a claim about that. So we'll file a claim about any discrimination, but I don't think the mere funding of some things versus other things is going to give rise to a claim. But if you find a specific program that does it, you can file a claim over that.
Yeah. The spirit of the question is good in the sense that I think whether it's this or probably even more relevant, this sort of trans madness, especially with kids and a lot of people who regret having surgery at 16, et cetera, getting the trial bar involved and marrying the incentive to make money for lawyers along with the vindication of rights and or the raising the cost of these sorts of abuses, I think would be welcome, as much as of course trial attorneys are bad in other ways. So it's an interesting solution. But as you said, Bill, maybe not immediately apparent how the class would form or argue for damages. Mark Bauerlein asks, what are the prospects for pressuring governors in solid red states to copy Florida's example? I think probably pretty good. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that Texas got into the banning of DEI offices. I mean, before I mentioned that there were 40 bills in 22 states and 7 of them passed. And but that means that bills were introduced in really ruby red states like Oklahoma and Ohio and Iowa and North Dakota and South Carolina and Alabama, and didn't even get to the floor in some of those cases, and certainly didn't get to a governor's desk for it to be signed. So, the question is how to overcome, we'll call it the complacency in those particular states to begin acting politically against this monster that they are funding, and knowing that it's going to be a long fight, and there's limits to what can be accomplished because of what the national government is foisting upon the states. And so what the prospects are, I think they're better every year. And Governor DeSantis' success, his resounding reelection, hopefully will show people the avenue toward popular rule on these matters.
I mean, one thing to understand, there's this huge divide developing in the country, even more so than it has been in the past, where the blue states are moving in the wrong direction and the red states are moving in the correct direction. So New York State University system, State University of New York, SUNY, this year for the first time introduced mandatory for all freshmen. This is a huge system. There's like 30 campuses or something, maybe more, of, I forget what they call it, but basically a DEI course. They may have some other name for it, but that's now mandatory. So as Florida and a few other states are trying to eliminate that, the blue states are getting even more heavily into it on the campuses. And that presents a choice. If you want your kid, or if you're a student and you don't want all that nonsense, go to college in Florida or Texas or someplace else. I mean, you'll find it there, as Scott has indicated, but it's not going to be as open and as blatant and as abusive. Or come to New York, come to the SUNY schools, come to any of a number of schools in New England, and you can get all of it that you want. And I think people need to start making those choices and understanding that there are choices to be made. And just like so many people are voting with their feet and leaving blue states for red states, I think you might find students, I hope you'll find students leaving blue colleges, to use a term, and heading to red colleges. And students need to be aware that those options are out there.
I'm going to combine a couple questions in the interest of time, one from Jonathan and one from Paul. And the questions they're very related. One is, what's the pushback like so far, and how do we foresee it moving forward against a lot of these efforts in places like Florida from organizations like the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, Libertarian Free Speech Group, for lack of a better description. And then the other question is, where do you all think the courts will come down on the First Amendment question with curriculum guides? Florida, had backed away from a few of their more aggressive legislative efforts because they were worried about possible court challenges. What do you guys think of those two related questions?
Yeah, well, I think people, legislation, I don't think you can merely look at the number of bills, because some of them are very poorly drafted. Some of them may have been spiked not because people got weak need, but substantively, but because they may have gotten opinions. This is not going to hold up. And it's the worst thing we can do is pass bad, poorly worded legislation that gets thrown out, because then you've handed the other side a victory. So I think, that is part of the problem, that particularly when it comes to First Amendment rights and things like that, we have to be very, very careful to only propose things that you can never be certain, but have a high degree of confidence will survive court challenge.
Yeah, and I think the thing that is most likely to survive court challenge is the attempt by state systems of education to dictate what's in the general ed, what acceptable majors are on universities, what degrees will be granted on the universities, what won't be granted on the universities. It's when they kind of go after things that are closer to what academic freedom or classroom freedom is. So the one Florida law I think that will be enjoined and not enforced is called the Stop Woke Act, which has been okayed in the K through 12. And what the Stop Woke Act, the part that's been enjoined, does is it prevents the teaching of so-called divisive concepts as truth. So that white people have a particular nature, that black people have a particular nature. That cannot be done in K through 12 education because it's called government speech. But they have enjoined that law in higher ed. Like, they're not enforcing it right now, and I don't know that they expect to win. I don't know what the contours of the law and the draws that they're going to get in appeals courts and such, how that lines up. But when FIRE and other libertarian groups complain that the state is putting forward standards for what the general ed is going to be, I think they are misunderstanding the purpose of state government, and they're kind of falling for a mid-century American idea that we just teach people how to think, not what to think. And we're always teaching people what to think, and the state should weigh in on the question of that by having standards for general ed that aren't purely formal but actually have substantive content.
We have I'm going to combine a couple other questions into this simplified one, which is how in Florida or elsewhere, Scott or Bill, how has the federal civil rights bureaucracy started to go after some of this stuff as you all have observed it?
I haven't seen very much of it. I think Office of Civil Rights for the U.S. Department of Education has been okay in some of their evaluations of complaints that have been filed. Obviously, it's fact dependent. So I think they've mostly played it straight. I mean, they're very slow moving, but I think they have. But I've not seen any effort by any of the massive agencies devoted towards eliminating discrimination to eliminate what we refer to as DEI discrimination. And that's up to, if we ever get another Republican president in our lifetime, that's up to that president to make sure he puts the rules in place, because executive orders can be tossed out on a whim with another executive order, but a rule has to go through a rulemaking process, and it's very time consuming. And certainly the Biden administration has spent now approaching 3 years trying to rewrite rules, and sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not, but it's a long process. So you need to do it the right way. You need to have the right people in place from day one, not 18 months into your administration. And you've got to put those policies in place that have some level of permanency, as well as legislation, obviously.
Can I do a presenter trick here, Ryan, and answer a different question? Am I allowed to do this?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Instead of the Office of Civil Rights, let's talk about just the United States Department of Education, because they are, like here in Florida, they're a big threat to any reform of the universities. And they do it like this. The United States Department of Education farms out the job of accrediting universities to some of these very big accreditors. There are 6 or 7 around the country. And you cannot get federal funds for student loans unless you're approved, your university is approved by some federally approved accreditor. And what the Department of Education does is it uses the accreditors to try to limit the reforms that states are imposing, state governments are using to govern their systems. And that Florida has 3 lawsuits or 3 approaches to the accreditation problem. But right now, they have been trying to change accreditors to ones that will allow the reforms that they have in mind. And the Department of Education has said, like, you can't change accreditors or you'll lose your Title IV, your student loan funds. So it may not be the Office of Civil Rights right now that is putting a kibosh on what states are doing, but it is the federal bureaucracy operating under orders of the Biden administration that is limiting the freedom of states to govern their own institutions. And they're doing it through this accreditation process that the Trump administration really loosened up by allowing universities to change accreditors, to go beyond the region that you're in and use national accreditors or accreditors from different regions. And what the Biden administration is saying, you have to stick with your accreditor unless the Department of Education approves you moving. And then they sit on your application to move. And so this is setting up big fights, but not through the Office of Civil Rights.
Yeah, that's interesting. Jonathan had a follow-up on Eric Kaufman's question. But what about, short of a federal board, maybe a Dear Colleague letter setting out best practices under Standards for Fair Admissions at Harvard compliance, and a requirement that highly selective universities submit a report to the education department explaining how they are complying?
Yeah, these Dear Colleague letters were used with great effect, particularly by the Obama administration. And so you have to control the federal government, you have to the executive branch. And if you're able to, all methods, I think, are on the table. I just don't like the idea of a disciplinary board or the equivalent of a disciplinary board. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think you can use the powers of the federal government to implement policies that, are to your, preference. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of federal powers that can be used, including things giving interpretations of what various rules and regulations mean.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I also agree that having a board, likely that would be difficult, and you need to control the executive. That seems right. The thing I think that our side should think about is how to define admissions transparency and require admissions transparency from the universities. The reason the Harvard case and the North Carolina case were successful is the charts that showed the admission criteria that were used based on race. Like, they're very compelling. And all right, so if Harvard jettisons the ACT and the SAT, and well, how are they making decisions and how did they apply at their universities? And if there's transparency, then there may also be grounds for lawsuits for violation. So I'm not saying that I have the answer to this, but I think that any solution to the problem would have to begin with transparency that would yield actionable causes if the principles of the Harvard case were violated.
We have a anonymous attendee ask, I have some hard evidence that shows my university is hiding the football and complying with these laws. What ways can I publicize this so that the people who have power will do something about it beyond writing just yet another op-ed?
What state are you in? And, because, one of the things that I've been doing is staying in touch with people who are in charge of this. And when I get, that is in the areas of education. And so when I get evidence like that, if it's someplace that I have developed connections, I try to share it with them. And, but, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, write another op-ed. And I don't think there's anything wrong with sending it to Bill and getting it up on criticalrace.org, right, Bill?
Yeah, I can't say we accept all submissions, but yeah, we're always looking for stories, and there are other publications that are always looking for stories. You've got to have the documentation and the proof, and shining a light on things. Sunlight is a disinfectant. I don't know if it's the best disinfectant, but it's a disinfectant. And we've been. I saw there was a question in the Q&A about what successes have we had in our 6 months at Equal Protection? And publicity can accomplish a lot. I mean, naming and shaming. University of Minnesota and Missouri State backed down from discriminatory programming when we did a media blitz over what they were doing, and they were embarrassed, and they should have been embarrassed because what they were doing was completely indefensible. So, getting publicity can have an impact. Doesn't always. Some say, I don't care. That's mostly in blue states, although Minnesota's, I guess blue, but they cared. And, and take it to your congressional representative, a letter from a, representative to the chancellor of the university system could have a big impact. And I agree, there's nothing wrong with another op-ed. I mean, that's part of informing people, so I wouldn't say don't write the op-ed. Write the op-ed and then send the op-ed to your congressman and ask the congressman to write a letter to the university. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, that's good. We've had a couple of questions about social and emotional learning. I know both of you have studied this a bit, but can we just run through really quickly what is social and emotional learning and what's its relation to critical race theory and DEI and all the rest?
I think it's probably best described as the gateway drug to all the rest. It's ill-defined, but it does open up kind of a victim mentality, an approach to portraying each student as a victim of a system. And that's how, there are others who know a lot more about it than I do, but that is frequently described to me as the foot in the door. Okay. That's how they get in, because it sounds fine. I mean, social emotional learning, who could be against that? Do you not, like dealing with students' emotions? So that's how it's been described to me. Perhaps Scott knows more of the details, but it's been described to me as the foot in the door.
Yeah, the way I would put it is that it's a delivery system for the critical theories. And I think C.S. Lewis talked about education as the job of shaping people's affections. And what social emotional learning is a way of shaping people's affections in class through stories, through trauma, through how would you like to be in these shoes kind of things. And in order to shape the affections of people, of young students, I'm going to put in the chat box here a report that we did on Florida's education system. In it, we talk about 8 delivery systems for critical theories, and transformative social and emotional learning, so-called, is one of these delivery systems. And so we have like 2 paragraphs on it near the beginning of this, so maybe that'll help. But that's the way I think of it: shaping the affections intentionally toward the ideology of critical theory.
That might have just gone to the panelists, Scott, so I'm going to drop it in for everyone just in case. But
all right, yeah, I'm incompetent at that. Yes, host and panelists. Sorry, guys.
No, don't worry about it. And you can find all of our reports at dc.claremont.org. Go to the left side and click on reports, and you'll see all of Scott and his colleague Anna Miller's work. I'm posting that now. So we're pretty much out of time. We like to keep this to an hour. I will just state, because the great Heather McDonald, who has done lots of wonderful work on this, insists we're ducking the elephant in the room on this question, which is, can we truly get back to colorblind meritocracy when it looks like, because of the persistent educational and skills gaps across the races, especially with given our history, the biggest elephant in the room between blacks and whites or other groups will persist, that this is going to be one of the hurdles. And it's something that prohibits us from talking frankly about this, because given America's history, we're very guilt-ridden and sensitive on that topic. Heather is right. She's written about this. I will just flag that for everyone. We'll just want to thank you all for joining us. If you want to support Claremont's work, go to claremont.org/donate. As I always joke, we don't really sell any widgets at Claremont. We're dependent on supporters like you all, so thank you. If you want to support Bill's work, go to legalinsurrection.com. It has a foundation and a C3 there to support their work, and check out all of our studies on these topics at dc.claremont.org, or in Bill's case, criticalrace.org or equalprotect.org. So thank you, Scott, and thank you, Bill. And I hope everyone enjoyed this. You'll get a follow-up email where if you'd like a recording of this video, we're happy to provide it. These are mostly insider videos for supporters of Claremont and friends. We don't really post them publicly, so we just ask that you share them with friends and family, but don't share them on Twitter. We like to preserve this somewhat bespoke experience for all the people that help us make this work possible. So thank you, Bill, and thank you, Scott, and thank you all for joining. Have a good evening.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.